thank you, members, to be able to present to you this morning. I know we had a session with Resource Committee a few weeks ago, but I think to be able to engage the full board this morning is very important. So I get the joyful side of it to articulate the scope of the problem and quantify, I suppose, from a financial position where we are and some of the decisions that we've taken both last year and some of the decisions we're likely to have to take this year, and then Mark's going to sort of consider more the service impact of that and discuss that with you. So the first slide that we're making reference to really is a bit of context as to where we are in what was a draft 3-year budget, albeit I accept it wasn't agreed and all the rest, but it was our first time in many, many years that we had the potential to have longer than single-year budgets. And that was taking us from 2022 to 25. Just to give you a little, you can see, I think these numbers are familiar to you, but we were projecting over those 3 years against our baseline budget that we had at the time that we would have a £226 million funding gap. Now that did change last year, whereby we had additional pressures that crystallised during 22-23, primarily around pay pressures on pay awards and pay settlements, which actually took us to an £80 million pressure last year. We managed to identify savings last year of £50 million and secured additional funding through the Department of Justice for 30, which enabled us effectively to break even at the end of last year. At the time, we were projecting a £75 million gap coming into this year, but in fact, the bounce in many ways, the recurrent impact of the pay awards both last year and coming into this year, and other pressures, mainly around utilities and fuel and so forth that wouldn't have been anticipated back in 2021, actually took our gap, as has been referred to the £107 million. Within that, we have identified savings both in pay and others early in the year, and by that I mean projecting into the year, of 33 million and 17 million, so circa 50 million. So those were known to us, really recurrent effects of decisions that we'd taken last year, that we could crystallise those this year. But that still left us with a £57 million gap very early in the year, circa April. Then further to that, we were notified of our actual budget going into this year. So we had a 1.7% reduction to our baseline budget. So you can see then that was starting to add further pressure to the 57 million. There was additional pressures coming in very early in the year. Again, you will be familiar that post-February into March, just with threat levels and so forth, we had pressures coming through very early. So in line with good accounting practice, we did another round of looking into where we could look at opportunities for savings. And you can see there a quantum of 16 million that we identified, and I will come on to that in more detail in the next slide. And then part of ring-fenced funding coming from the department and so forth, that means that we're sitting, as you say, with still a residual gap of £38 million that at this juncture, we don't have any eyes on as to how we can actually close that gap. So in conclusion on that slide, I think it's fair to say you can see that our projected costs do currently exceed the budget that we have been allocated, even with significant attempts, circa £70 million of savings that we're identifying in year. So just so that we're not talking about the gap, but that we do communicate to you this morning just the quantum of the budget that's been allocated. You can see that last year the settlement of the budget was 836 million, and going into this year it's sitting at 816. I did take a look back. We speak to you regularly on the proportion of that is staff related, staff costs related in direct staff pay, and other associated staff costs that are fixed. And it leaves us actually that even as we look at savings with regard to reduction of headcount with natural attrition, it does leave us quite a small amount of that 800 million that we've actually got access to that doesn't relate to people and hence pay. I look back to 2010, 2011 at what our budget was then, and it was over 830 million in 2010, 2011. So even taking a very crude 2% inflationary uplift year on year, that would have had us at about £300 to £350 million more than what we're sitting with now. So there has been a huge effort over the past decade, particularly in and around non-pay, to protect the headcount in the organisation, to be efficient and effective in the delivery of our service. Again, because the in-year allocations I've put up, mainly that you can see that year on year it would have been common that we receive in-year allocations in addition to our opening baseline budget. We have over 700 officers and 150 staff who are, the funding stream is in-year money, in-year allocations in a non-recurrent way, so it's not part of the core main grant, and that's very difficult for us to manage. And therefore the in-year allocations has been a mechanism for us to be able to augment our budget year on year. We've been advised that that's unlikely this year. There may be some monitoring rounds in July, technical ones and capital ones, but by way of having access to additional revenue to support us addressing the gap, we're being told at the moment certainly that is looking unlikely. You can see what this has meant by way of our headcount, both in officers and staff. So coming into 2022, we had 7,008 officers. At the close of March, that was at 6,699, and we're projecting that to go to 6,358 this year. That's a year-on-year reduction of 5% on our workforce, and it's exactly the same for staff. It's that natural attrition of people leaving the organisation. And you can see the police staff has gone from the 2,589, and we're projecting that to 2,336. I mean, it is very challenging for us, both from that natural attrition. We have had small elements of recruitment last year, a small amount into the start of 23-24 for officers, 83, but no further recruitment planned this year. And indeed, I'll come on to a slide, if that continues into next year, that's particularly challenging. I did look back and consider this bit that we're effectively structuring our services to fit within the budget allocation that we currently have, as opposed to delivering against the needs as to what has been identified. The Department of Justice did publish long-term objectives back in 2015 for policing, and indeed the Policing Board, both in its policing strategy and plan on the short to medium. But I think it's clear to us all, as we look at our service operating models into this year and next year, that we are now, our operating model is being driven by the budget as opposed to the needs of the population that we're serving. That's quite worrying. Okay, so the next slide really is just to focus on those particular areas of savings going into the 23-24 year. I think they're known to you, but I think it's important to touch on some of these. Headcount reductions you will be familiar with, that's 32 million. That's the reductions both last year and the recurrent effect of that coming into this year. Overtime, we have a small amount of overtime that sits as part of our main grant, and we are seeking to reduce that even further this year. The reality of that is it's already under pressure, and I would say Mark will come to that from an operational delivery perspective and how challenging it is going to be to meet that. We have £10 million of savings identified through estate work, and really that means that it will be core repairs and health and safety issues that we will be funding, and very little else as we look into the year. Our additional security funding, both last year and this year, had actually identified £9 million more than is within the overall ASF budget. We had been subventing that for a number of years internally via the main grant, but we're not in a position to do that anymore, so that has reduced an element of activity in that area. We had been anticipating coming into this year, having done our service management statement work, looking at our demand and capacity and areas for transformation, that we would have a budget assigned to that. But again, we have reduced that pretty much to a very small amount, a couple $100,000, as just a recognition that it was discretionary spend, and we just weren't going to be able to afford that this year. You can see savings in and around fleet. The overall transport expenditure is going to be down about 15%, which is quite significant. Both last year and this year, that really translates into what we would say is grounding cars. So as cars have been damaged, we're deferring those into further financial years and effectively grounding them for a period of time. And one of the considerations in there, also part of our 90-day review, is the consideration of grounding one of the helicopters. The £1 million associated to PSNI, which is our colleagues, our contract with Forensic Services in Northern Ireland, we have maintained the level of service level agreement that we had with them. they were seeking an increase of £1 million. Understandably, there is additional demand and work that would normally be going their way, but we have had to say that we can't do that, and we will operate within the service level agreement that was previously there. And the last two lines, travel, again, travel and subsistence, it's a small budget to start with, but again, from a discretionary spend point of view, we are saving £1 million out of what was a £3 million budget, so 3 down to 2. And a number of other measures against a number of more sundry incidental lines to give us our £69 million. So just to, that's in many ways the pay and the non-pay in a quantum, but to give some context as to what that means, both on our recruitment and the levers and the net headcount within the organisation. So this slide shows you that we went into last year with 7,008 officers. We had a small level of recruitment during 22-23 of 121, and you can see the levers of 430. As part of our resource plan that was presented to the board last year, which did look at the 3-year aspect of this, we were seeking a similar level of recruitment into 23-24. We did bring that annualised amount forward and undertook that in April, May and June. We commissioned that in March prior to the current budget award, and all those students are now into the college and will come out effectively in the autumn. But you can see that the net effect of that last year was 309 officers leaving the organisation net, 341 this year. And I've just put in for comparative purposes against the 3-year draft budget that on the basis of us being advised that we're not to recruit going into next year, that would affect over the 3-year period 1,054 officers less across the organisation, which is quite dramatic. And as we've said before, that equates to effectively an officer a day leaving the organisation over that period of time, and is hugely impactful. Just similar on the then police staff for information as well. So starting with 2552 last year, there had been an increase actually in the police staff year, a small one, because going into the year we had undertaken significant recruitment, particularly around our ASO staff, and we had contractual commitments to appoint them. But you can see the net impact coming into this year, potential reduction of 253, and similarly going into next year, 143. So it's the same effect. That 359 equates again to 15% similar to officers. They're very consistent. There is a number of issues both within the police officers and police staff that we're currently looking at as part of our resource and allocation model, because we have critical posts. On the officer sides, we have statutory posts where responsibilities have to be undertaken. And on the police staff side, there are a number of posts that are single posts. So, I've referred, for instance, to the like of the helicopters and pilots and things like that. So there will be very small number of essential recruitment that will happen, but they will be very small in number, and the most of what you see in front of you will crystallise. We have started our resource allocation model meetings again, and they very much directly link into the work that Aldrina and the team are participating in around the transformation work. Which is effectively looking at the operating models across the organisation. People are leaving, retiring, leaving, so actually crystallising the financial impact of this just happens. Our challenge in the organisation is when those people leave, are they leaving in the places that we can manage the risk? Or do we have to sit back and look at how we deliver our service and change how we deliver our service? And that's what we call our operating model work. So that sits as part of our transformation work this year, as well as a focus in and around digital, estates, and indeed the fleet. And to front end that on foot of getting our notification of our budget, we're in the middle pretty much of what we're calling the 90-day review, which is looking at the operating model short term, also looking at aspects around our contact management, our SEAs, our station inquiry offices, CCTV, I've mentioned the heli, and indeed the aspect of bureaucracy that we're undertaking. It very much lines straight up to the transformational work. We don't want to be taking decisions now to affect savings that are counter-strategic to the transformation work. So it's keeping a straight line running through all these projects that they're complementary to each other and make sense for the organisation. And I hand over to Mark.
Thank you, Pamela, Chair, Vice Chair, and members. So, just a couple of points to start with. I'm going to try and help the members understand some of the impacts that this may, we think, is going to have on policing. But just to say, first of all, I mean, what you're seeing in front of you are forecasted projections for downward pressure on numbers. I've been on the team 10 years. We have affected huge efficiency savings, but we sought for many, many years to protect headcount. Headcount did dip a little bit, but the year Pamela came to work with us, we were projecting our headcount to be 7,100. We were going to recruit an extra 100 that year, so 2.5 years ago, to invest further in neighbourhood vulnerability and also some armed support. And there was an aspiration to at least then try through negotiations with the executive to at least push that to 27273, and then obviously there's the new decade discussions about potentially 75. I say that by way means of that the strategies of the organisation were based upon growth, not upon reduction, and the performance of the organisation was based upon enhancing performance, improving the safety of people for Northern Ireland, getting to calls quicker, going to more calls, getting better criminal justice outcomes with more people. And there's a bit of a debate around, how many police do you need and how good is all that? Well, I mean, if you want the performance details, then I would recommend everybody who's watching to look at the end of your report. It's a positive report. It's as comprehensive as I've seen in my time in the service executive team. And I'll give some more details as we go along. But it is important to realise that we are in a complete reverse gear here, not a forward-looking gear. And for me, that's the main headline today about where your policing is going. It's going backwards, not forwards. Now, it doesn't mean that your police officers and staff are going backwards, not forwards. It's nothing to do with the amount of effort or discretionary effort or commitment or love for the job or passion for saving lives in Northern Ireland and protecting people. That is undiminished, but it's going to be under huge pressure against, call demand of maybe 210,999 calls a year, 500,000 101 calls, 29,000 incidents that involve mental health, 111,000 crimes. These are the types of things that we're asking the police service to respond to on an annualised basis and cops to go to and deal with and resolve. And it's against that context, I sort of want to try and help understand where the numbers are and how that downward pressure start to crystallise. Now, as the Vice Chair mentioned at the start, the policing is really complex. And I'm going to try and simplify parts of it for you. But it's also a mixture of art and science. It's a human endeavour. So the science is about the numbers that we get in. The art is in how we actually manage stuff. And then there's science then about how we apply policy and procedures and try and get outcomes for people, including investigating Category A murders, terrorist offences, rapes, child abuse investigations. I mean, child abuse alone online has gone up 600% in the last 10 years. So these are the types of things that there's the balance between the art and the science, and I know there's a massive appetite to try and understand in very empirical detail how this is going to impact upon people. I can't give you all those answers today. What I will say is that policing also involves individuals. So it's the individuals, the citizens of Northern Ireland, who will start to feel the impact around delay, around quality, around accessibility, around visibility to policing services, around the speed at which we come. So the forecasted projections in front of you, so local policing is what most people see. Either that's your police officers in patrol cars, either in neighbourhood urban response out there doing the most visible element of what we do. So last year we took 91 posts out. Most of those were vacant already, but they were due to be filled. So they haven't been filled. And then this year, on just a numerical projection, that area of business could lose up to 171 posts. So it would be 260 less constables available for the front line than there were 12 months ago at the end of the next 12 months. And then obviously then there's the further projection into 24, 25. In crime, which is our detectives, well, we lost 97 detective posts last year. We're probably another 98 to take out this year, which leaves nearly 200 detective posts down in a 2-year period. Operational support, which is your TSG, roads policing, armed response, 140 over the 2-year period. Justice, smaller figures, but even 40 constables out of those. Impacts upon our ability to turn around files, crime, investigation, follow-up, and so forth. So these are kind of cumulative impacts. Now, those actual numbers may vary, but the bottom totals won't. So these are the decisions we're trying to finesse at the minute, just about the levels of impact across the various elements of business, and which the ACCs in particular are discussing. And can I just give you some headlines, qualitative headlines from your assistant chief constables, just based upon those figures. So, and there's a couple of headlines just so, I mean, from district policing, and I'll quote here: we expect over time to have fewer neighbourhood officers and fewer response officers. This will require consolidation to smaller teams and greater spans of responsibility. The fewer neighbourhood teams have less capacity, and the function of the neighbourhood team could be effectively halted in certain areas. Less capacity of partnerships, preventative problem solving work, a reduction to station opening hours, just as a headline. Crime department, well, probably having to focus capacity at higher levels only. We're seeing increases in crime and exploitation of common travel area. We're seeing complex investigations taking longer to progress, adding to delay in courts. The ability of us to keep pace with the evolving scale and complexity of cyber investigations, digital investigations, is going to be severely depleted. Current delivery models will not be able to be maintained. And this is all against the backdrop of a serious threat. We're already seeing in OSD searches being cancelled, an increased inability to meet search and public order demands. Since January this year, has been 30 searches cancelled. That's searches for criminality and all sorts of other issues. We've seen a 100% increase in fatal road traffic accidents between this period and last year, but a reduction in our roads policing capability. The amount of bids that we're servicing to support the front line is under increasing demand, but against less capacity. And those are just some of the headlines that the chief officers are trying to wrestle with at the minute. So, it's the green button. Right, so there's a slide here which is as a result of the service management statement that we have been working through, and this is a mixture of the art and the science. This is a mixture of what science we can apply at the minute and the professional assessment of the most senior people in the organisation. So red being where demand and resource or impact is over a 5% increase of demand and resource, and yellow being amber where there's slightly less than 5. So these are how we're grading at the minute some of the problems we're having. There, for example, for number one is corporate finance. So that's not a forward police functioning role; it's a support role, but it's in a red condition. Request for service, red. Prevention and deterrence, red. Managing offenders, red. Managing serious organised crime, red. Protecting vulnerable people, red. So these are our professional assessments of the levels of pressure of inward demand against resource that we're starting to face. It's obviously illustrative. There's a lot of data behind it. As I said, it's based both upon our professional judgment and empirical data, and against those 12 areas, which we can talk about in more length with the board at various times. I just want to come back to that slide if I can. Now, I just want to talk overall about crime rates, and this is part of the reason for saying this is about what we're trying to preserve. So the level of recorded crime in Northern Ireland, and you'll see this in your report, compares so favourably with these islands. It's unbelievable. We are technically the lowest recorded crime rate per 1,000 population for anywhere in England and Wales, against our most similar forces. And sometimes people are concerned with me. Well, that says, oh, well, obviously you're doing a great job, so you could squeeze more. No, this is because of the work we're doing. This is the ultimate qualitative and quantitative assessment of your police service, is the amount of crime that we have to manage, and the safety of our community. And the outcome rates in Northern Ireland are the envy of chief constables anywhere in the UK in terms of, and they're not high enough, but our outcome rates are better than any. So this is what we are trying to preserve in Northern Ireland, and this is done against the backdrop of the fact that we are a standalone police service with little or no support from other police services, as others do across other parts of GB. So the prize is very great, and is a take this back to the point that the whole process of investment with us was to try and improve the levels of safety by deploying more police officers, particularly in neighbourhood policing. We'll come back to neighbourhood policing in a second. So crime demand, this is just illustrative. So crime itself was up about 14.9% last year. This is just the in-year increase of 3.7%. We're going, obviously, we have within the calendar year, increases in domestic violence, increases in rape. Rape was at a higher rate in May and June last year than it had ever been on record. We have increases in human trafficking. All this is outlined for you in the report to the board. Huge increase in cybercrime, massive increase in child sexual exploitation, both online and offline. All of us in our families are getting inundated with fraud attempts. I don't know anybody in the world now who hasn't been subject to some sort of phishing email, phishing text, phone calls, and particularly focused upon the vulnerable and the elderly. It's probably the most prolific unreported crime, but also the most prolific crime that we're all experiencing in our communities at the minute. Homicide. I'm not going to name any of the cases that have gone through recently, but you're well aware of we have an increasing trend in homicide in Northern Ireland. We have a particular focus on homicide against women. Most of it is domestically motivated. It's extremely violent and has horrific outcomes, both obviously for families and for the broader community. It relies upon a really strong investigative cadre of people who can investigate them, but also relies upon a hugely proactive program through our Violence Against Women and Girls strategy to try and reduce the incidence of domestic violence in our communities, and also the incidence of female homicide and other homicides. And our assessment is going to come under massive pressure. Terrorism, the last year has obviously seen the threat level in Northern Ireland go to severe. This has a massive cost. It has a cost that isn't calculated against any other comparable police service on these islands, or probably any comparable police service in Western Europe. It builds in a lot of capital costs, it builds in a lot of revenue costs, and also builds in policing deployments that aren't seen anywhere else. So your head count also, hidden in the head count are the numbers that we need to try and keep our officers safe, to try and allow them to get to the calls, to deal with the crimes that are on that sheet. There is no other police service that I am aware of in a democratic society where the police service themselves are the targets of some of the most serious crime to try and prevent them doing their job. I spoke about this recently at an international conference and with very senior people from lots of international forces, and nobody was having to consider the prospect of police officers being murdered or injured on their way to calls to help the public. So it's a complexity that isn't seen anywhere else, but it is costly to manage. But one which your officers manage on a daily basis to try and deal with the myriad of issues that are on that sheet. And I mean, I could probably go on all day, but I know we get the questions here, but I'll push on if I may. I'm sure there are, Chair. So I mean, we'll just try and give a bit more here. Just so the neighbourhood officers, we try to have about 700 neighbourhood officers. Simon and I pushed very hard to get to the ceiling. In practice, we're probably operating around 500 at the minute because of abstractions and inability to fill them. Bobby in DPC is the kind of lifeblood for the organisation. So with 83 officers coming into the organisation, all of them go into DPC, 415 going out. So every officer comes in and to move across the organisation has to go through DPC and out. So in reality, what's happening now as the pipe dries up going in, we are unable to push people out of the first roles they go into in DPC, into neighbourhood officers, into CID, into counter-terrorist specialist firearms officers, into surveillance, into child abuse investigators and so forth. So last year we tried to protect as greatly as we could DPC numbers, but now we're going to see that impact in crystallising in a real way, because we haven't got the supply of people into the organisation, and this will affect the neighbourhood numbers dramatically, because we just won't have the supply of people going in to fill the neighbourhood vacancies. So there will be a reduction in neighbourhood officers. What we're trying to work out is what the floor for that is, where that becomes, where we can take that to and still be effective. and also hopefully ring fence them, and we talked about that at the last board. But the neighbourhood officers and the rest of Bobby's team and OSD are primarily involved in trying to manage all and this is just like a taster of the issues that we're dealing with. So, for example, already this year we've had the President of the United States here, we've had the coronation visit, we also have had the Good Friday Agreement visit. I mean, that cost us £6.2 million that we didn't have and still don't have. With the 12th of July coming, which is an annual celebration, and we respect that, and the policing operations have reduced over the years, but there's going to be a very significant operation in the next couple of weeks. And again, these are unfunded pressures. We had the council elections, we have a number of sporting events, we've had to deal with industrial actions, bonfires coming, we've got Halloween coming, we've got Christmas coming. Now, we spent £30 million in overtime last year, which was £2 million over the profile for last year. The profile for this year is £26 million. That splits down as £20 million for the security funding, £6 million for main grant. Main grant is normal business. We're already £2 million overspent in the first 2 months of this year against the security expenditure. So we haven't got the money to police these events or the resources to the levels at which the public would require us to do it. So we are now having to take even more risk-based decisions about deployments, which means there's going to be less visibility at big events, less police there, because we started with a deficit. This type of expenditure is money that we don't have, particularly where it goes beyond normal daily opportunity costs. And that's just, well, I've never seen that situation before in policing. So by quarter 3, I don't know if we'll have anything left to police major events with. And again, without labouring this, she's looking at me here, but if we were in other parts of Great Britain, we would just put resources in from other people to help. We have no help. None. Mutual aid, is at a premium anyway, but we can't get it overnight. So if we have big problems overnight, we have to just turn our own resources to do it. And with less people to do that with this year, and then less money to photocopy the people who are here to make them do the job twice. Because overtime like a photocopier, it takes the same police officer and just puts them on again. So there's the downward on the head count and the downward on the overtime. And in previous years, we might have had downward pressure on overtime, but not downward pressure on the head count. So we've got both coming together, which is making this exceptionally difficult for us to get through. So I am now going to stop, and the chief will just finish me off.